On the 1st of September 1939, German forces began their invasion of Poland. 2 days later, following Berlin's dismissal of the ultimatum to remove all troops back to their borders, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the world was plunged headfirst into a Second World War, just 21 years after the ending of the First. Virtually nowhere would be left untouched in the coming 6 years, and this region would be no exception. In fact, bearing witness to one of the first casualties of the war fought at sea just a handful of days after the declaration. And one of its lifeboats would take part in the first rescue in British waters during the war. As is the case with all these stories, though, we do not begin in the dark days of the Second World War, but rather in the much brighter and more hopeful years following the 1918 armistice. With the war now behind them, Britain, as well as many other countries, began to rebuild what had been destroyed. Among the key areas Britain not only wanted to rebuild but grow was its merchant fleet, that had been badly mauled by its first taste of unrestricted submarine warfare. Among the shipping companies now clamouring to rebuild was T&J Brocklebank of Liverpool, a company with roots dating back to 1785, and they would turn to an equally respected and trusted company to supply them, the shipyards of Lithgow Limited of Glasgow. And with this partnership, the life of a new ship began. Laid down in 1920, first simply known as number 730, teams of shipbuilders worked hard and fast as they were known to do, and before the year was out, she was mostly complete, being launched on the 17th of November 1920 as SS Magnapore, a merchant steamer, finally completed in 1921. She stood at 499.6 feet in length, a beam of 64 feet, and a draught of 34.2 feet, powered by 2 steam turbine engines, giving her 1,147 horsepower, equating to a speed capacity of 13.5 knots, with a carrying capacity of 9,237 gross registered tonnage. SS Magdapur may sound like a strange name for a British ship, but sailing with the Brocklebank line, she would primarily be sailing to India, where they had done a huge amount of their business for over 100 years. And by the time she took to sea, like many ships in this line of work, India was much more than a port of call. It was home for much of the ship's company, being made up of a group called Lascars, sailors from India who mostly worked in the engine room and below-deck stations. I have been unable to find much about her career before meeting her untimely end, other than an incident that took place in Baltimore on the 18th of March 1929. 3 members of her crew, all of whom were from modern-day Sri Lanka, known at the time as Ceylon, were ordered to take up a heavy mooring line, a job that normally took at least twice this number. The Indian members of the crew, for some reason I've been unable to find out, did not work while the ship was in American waters. Despite this, there were several European members of the crew, as well as 7 Americans who were working on board while the ship was docked in America, who could have assisted. But it seemed the ship's chief officer at the time insisted that it had to be these 3 and the job had to be done alone. In the following movements, as they moved the mooring line, it flew up and struck one of the men, badly injuring them. He would attempt to sue the shipping company for negligence, but it does not seem that he was successful. In 1935, SS Magnapore was taken into dry dock to undergo a refit that would decrease her overall length to 473 feet and reduce her tonnage to 8,641. But while SS Magnapore and other ships like her plied their trade across the world's oceans, an altogether different fleet was under construction. The Nazi Party had taken control of Germany in 1933, promising a brighter Germany following the years of political turmoil and the hardships following the end of the Great War. Not only did they plan to rebuild Germany, they also planned to rebuild its ability to wage war, ignoring all sanctions placed on them by the Treaty of Versailles in 1920. To begin with in secret, and then after more openly, they began to rebuild the size of the army and the number of the Air Force's planes. Among their new and growing forces was, of course, the Navy as well, and more importantly for our story, the famous, or some would say infamous U-boats that had plagued the Allies of the First World War so badly with unrestricted submarine warfare. It would be in the shipyards of Deutsche Werke, Yard 248, in the northern German city of Kiel in 1935, the second player in our story would come into birth, the U-13, laid down on the 20th of June 1935. She would be a Type 11B submarine with a length of 140 feet 1 inch, a beam of 13 feet 15 inches, and a height of 28 feet 3 inches, powered by two 4-stroke cylinder diesel engines or a 700 metric horsepower double-acting electric motor that powered two shafts with 3-foot propellers to be used while she was submerged. She was capable of operating at depths down to 150 metres and had a total operation range of 1,800 nautical miles. In terms of armaments, the U-13 had three 21-inch torpedo tubes, and she would carry 5 torpedoes, or up to 12 or 18 mines depending on the type, as well as a 2-centimetre anti-aircraft gun. When the work was finished, she was launched on the 9th of November 1935, commissioned on the 30th of the same month, and entered service in the 1st U-boat flotilla, operating out of Kiel, where her crew of 26 would spend just under 4 years, training and retraining, ready for the time they were finally called to war. At 7:30 in the evening of Saturday the 9th of September 1939, SS Magnapore set off on what would prove to be her final voyage, heading from the port of South Shields along the east coast down to Southampton. She was carrying no cargo on this leg of the journey, known as being in ballast. She was commanded by Arthur George Dixon, assisted by the second officer, Harry Atherton, with 81 souls on board. They sailed alone rather than being part of a convoy, hoping the darkness of the night would be all the protection they would need. Everything would go well for them that night, and much of the second day as well, until they were travelling along the Suffolk coast, having recently passed the most easterly point in Britain. Unknown to them, the U-13, under the command of Karl von Eichen, had come through the area on the 4th, dropping sea mines that now lay silent on the surface, waiting for a victim. As she sailed along the Suffolk coast nearing Orford Ness, through the sea lane that ran between the Sizewell sandbank and the Nape of Aldborough, the ship was suddenly rocked by a heavy explosion, and began to take on water. Several on land who heard this explosion described it as a low growl. As the cold waters came rushing in, her boilers exploded as well, rocking the ship a second time. Nearby ships rushed to her aid, but found there was very little they could do, and fearing for their own safety, having no idea what had caused the explosion, many feared it had come from a torpedo. With an unseen enemy just waiting to claim more targets, they soon pulled off away from her for their own safety. The only real hope for the crew of the Magdapur laid on shore now, in the hands of the volunteers of the Aldborough lifeboat. The news of the explosion reached them shortly after at about 3:20 p.m. The shout went out and all members of the crew assembled, as they had done time and time again. They dropped whatever they were doing and rushed to get ready to launch, and just 17 minutes after getting the message, they were heading out to sea towards the doomed vessel. They headed out on the lifeboat Abby Beauclair. The lifeboat had been immortalised by the artist Eric Ravelos, who had painted this picture during a visit to the town the summer before in August 1938. Rather grimly, Eric himself would be lost at sea on the 2nd of September 1942, while working as a war artist, when the plane he was travelling on went down off the coast of Iceland. The sea was calm that day, and it aided their journey to the site. But when they arrived, there was little that could have prepared them for what was waiting, although it was a sight that many in the RNLI would soon become familiar with by the end of the war. The explosion of the boilers had broken the back of the SS Magnapore, destroying the ship's bridge and radio room, as well as smashing 4 of her lifeboats to splinters. As the water came rushing in, the oil came pouring out into the North Sea. More seriously, they soon realised that several of the men were already in the water, trying to swim their way through the oil slick, either towards them or to the safety of the ship's lifeboat that had been launched. It was a necessary thing to do often, but incredibly dangerous. Ingesting oil while swimming was often fatal. Undaunted, the Suffolk lifeboat pulled closer, and aided in pulling 12 men, most of whom were injured from the water. A couple were so badly hurt they had to be given artificial resuscitation by the lifeboat's crew. Among those pulled from the water was a badly injured Captain Dixon. Once they had finished pulling these men from the waters, they made their way to the nearby ships. Some of the Magnapore's crew had already made their way to them under their own steam, but now it was far easier to load them back onto the lifeboat and take them back to Walberswick this way than them waiting for the ship's next port of call. As the lifeboat left the site, this photo was taken, showing the final moments of SS Magnapore. She fully sank at 5:25 in the evening. In the following weeks there would be some confusion of what exactly had happened that day. The sea lanes were regularly swept for mines, and there was no sign of anything that could have been a torpedo attack. It wasn't until other ships were sunk or damaged in similar ways that the Royal Navy came to the terrible conclusion. The Germans were now using magnetic mines, able to pull themselves right into the path of unsuspecting ships. Although miles out to sea, Suffolk's first taste of war had not gone unnoticed by several people on shore, and they were now trying to work out what was going on. Among them was David Davidson, who would later fight his way up through Italy and into Austria as a lieutenant in the Kensington Regiment. But on that day in 1939, he found himself slightly along the coast near Walberswick. A small lump appeared on the horizon. With binoculars, I could see a ship, nose down, stern up in the air, sunk presumably by enemy mine. No one believed me first, but a look through the binoculars soon convinced them. As the Abbey Beauclerc made their way back to shore, they were being watched by the branch's secretary, Mr. Walter Riggs, and a surgeon, Dr. Robin Aikeston, who, seeing the sheer number of men crammed onto the little lifeboat, knew that them living or dying was now in their hands, and they prepared all they could do before they reached land. They alerted the local St. John's ambulance, the Shipwrecked Mariners Society, and all other first aid organisations and medically trained locals they could find. This mishmash of groups descended on the lifeboat station to help the survivors. The badly injured were loaded onto stretchers and taken to nearby hospitals, but the vast majority were able to walk down the plank under their own power, although nearly every man was suffering from exhaustion. The swift and professional actions of everyone involved in the rescue meant that 74 men had been saved from the wreck and brought back to shore, among them 56 Lascars. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, 5 men had been lost during the sinking, and their bodies would never be found. Among the men pulled from the water, though, was the ship's second officer, Harry Atherton, badly injured from the explosion and then ingesting oil while in the water. He died before the Abbey Beauclerc reached dry land. He was 37 years old, but the only one of the dead to have a marked grave. The rescue had taken a little over 2 hours, but for the crew of the lifeboat, now with everyone who could be saved, they came a much less glamorous job, cleaning the lifeboat of the oil and the blood and being ready for their next rescue. The U-13 claimed the first kill of her war that day, and in the following months she would play her part in cutting the supply lines to Britain. 6 days later, the passenger steamer City of Paris fell victim to another one of her mines, badly damaging it and killing one of the 139 people on board. And soon the U-13 were running up a score of victories. Among them the French cargo ship Phryne, the British merchant vessel Bowling, torpedoed and sinking with all hands on the 19th of November 1939. An attack on the Norwegian vessel Start on the 31st of January 1940 again would leave no survivors. And the next day, an attack on a cargo ship belonging to neutral Sweden, sinking the Fram off the northern coast of Scotland, costing the lives of 9 of her 23 crew. In the 9 patrols the U-13 would take part in, she was ultimately responsible for the loss of 9 ships, along with damaging 3 others. 54,274 gross registered tons was sent to the bottom, and more importantly, she claimed the lives of over 80 people. Ultimately, though, it would prove to be a fairly short war for her. And rather fittingly, it would come to an end not far from where it had begun, only a few miles along the Suffolk coast, 11 nautical miles off Lowestoft, on the 31st of May 1940, while the Battle of France raged on. She was spotted by the crew of the sloop HMS Western on anti-submarine duties. They began to drop depth charges on her, and with little choice left, the U-13's commander, now a man named Max Martin Schult, ordered her to be scuttled and for his men to abandon ship. All of her crew would survive the sinking and would be taken as prisoners of war. Shortly after, the site of her wreck was bombed by the Luftwaffe, hoping to destroy the Enigma machine on board, and they were in part successful, but elements did survive and were salvaged by Royal Navy divers and sent on to the code breakers at Bletchley Park. The wreck of the U-13 today is now completely covered by the sand of the North Sea. The men of the Abbey Beauclerc were the first lifeboat crew to take part in a wartime rescue. And unknown to anyone at the time, in a matter of months, she would take part in a much larger rescue, one of an almost unprecedented and unimaginable scale. As along with 19 other lifeboats from around the country, she worked tirelessly during the Dunkirk evacuation. Made to land on beaches, they were perfect for getting in close to the shore, where bigger ships could not venture. I will cover this story in more detail in future. But the Abby Beauclerc would survive this ordeal and would carry on in service until 1959. Although many, including the crew of the U-13 herself, were happy to give them credit for the sinking, others have theorised it may have in fact been a tragic accident that led to the demise of the Magnapore, and the mine may have in truth been one of the near countless British sea mines laid to deter Germans from landing troops along the east coast of Britain. But if this is true, we will probably never know. The wreck of SS Magnapore lays where she sank, in some 70 feet of water off the coast of Walberswick in Suffolk. Of the 6 men who lost their lives in the sinking, 2 were British and 4 Indian. All are commemorated in various locations around the world. Harry Atherton, the ship's second officer, originally from Redcar in Yorkshire, is laid to rest in the Alderney Edge Cemetery in Cheshire, grave number 657. Ralph Bell was the ship's radio operator. He hailed from Brandon in Northumbria. His name can be found on the Unan Cemetery Memorial in Scotland. And as for the 4 members of the Indian Merchant Navy who perished in the cold waters of the North Sea so far from home, all 4 of them, Ali Azhar, Maning Konar, Ali Roshan, and Amir Sharik, names can be found on the Bombay Chattagong 1939 to 1945 war memorials, along with the names of 6,466 others who gave their lives in the Indian Navy and Merchant Navy during the Second World War, and it can be found today in the city of Mumbai. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was the sinking of SS Magnapore, Suffolk's first taste of the Second World War. And this was a little bit of history. And a slight add-on to the end of this video that I will mention for the next couple, and then every now and then in future. I have recently set up an Instagram account for the channel. We'll be posting some pictures of mine that I've used in presentations, and other ones from around the area and other places I am visiting. So please go to the link in the description to follow that if you wish.